Hey there, folks. John Henry, lowgenius.net, and the new progressive muckraker.com. Probably gonna lose some support with this one, but I think it's time we have a what a friend of mine used to call a come to Jesus meeting with this Ron Paul nonsense. I've been listening to this crap for 20 years. It's about time people wake up. And it's, since the internet exploded, it's just gotten even worse. I'm fed up with it. Ron Paul is no different or better than any other right-wing Republican in any substantive way. His primary basis of support among young people comes from his support for cannabis legalization and his penchant for framing his arguments in populist rhetoric, a trick that plenty of other hard-right conservatives have played many times. See the Tea Party, for instance. Part of what prompted this was seeing a 15-minute interview with Cenk Uygur on his MSNBC show with Dr. Paul. Cenk, as you probably know, is now again the lead at really the only remaining news organization on the planet with any consistent integrity over at the Young Turks. Paul's statements and positions during this interview were typical of his rhetoric and exposed glaring holes in both his logic and his saccharine populism. Now, before we go into this, I want to make clear, I don't think Ron Paul is stupid. If he was, he might have an excuse for some of his positions. Now, Uyghur's first question in this interview to Paul was in reference to his vote in favor of a $30 billion subsidy to oil companies. The question, verbatim, why did you do that? And Paul's first response, well, that depends on how you define subsidies. Classic political avoidance. He goes on to say, I don't consider any tax break a subsidy, and launches into a self-righteous spiel about how it wasn't a spending bill, which wasn't asserted in the first place, and pats himself on the back for never voting for a spending bill. Great. That might play well to high school seniors and college freshmen. The rest of us can see through that bullshit, Paul. That's why you don't get elected in major elections. This myth that Ron Paul opposes government spending needs to be exploded. Paul spent 5 years drawing paychecks from the United States Air Force and the Air National Guard. After being elected in a special election for a short term as U.S. Representative in 1976, replacing Robert Casey, who was appointed to the Federal Maritime Commission by then-President Gerald Ford, he lost in the general election that year but ran again in 1978. He won that election and was re-elected to Congress again in 1980 and 1982. He ran for the Senate in 1984, attempting to draw another 6 years of federal pay, and in 1988 ran for president as the Libertarian Party candidate. Now, Paul returned to medical practice after the campaign, and I'll credit him for not accepting funds from government health programs, choosing instead to work pro bono for poor patients. His son Rand, who pushes the same empty fantasies, did take Medicaid funds from his practice. Of course, he had several other sources of income, so he wasn't hurting for money. However, it would be unfair and biased of me not to recognize that in this, at least, his behavior was consistent with his stated positions. Additionally, he's consistently refused to collect a congressional pension. Well, good for him. In 1992, Paul supported noted race baiter and homophobe Pat Buchanan in his bid as Libertarian Party presidential candidate and was an advisor to the Buchanan campaign. In 1996, Paul returned to congressional politics, running for and winning again in Texas with the support of billionaire flat tax fantasy shill Steve Forbes and some quid pro quo support from Buchanan. It was during this campaign that some of Paul's offensive and condescending attitudes towards minorities became widely known. Several excerpts were made public from his newsletter, including a remark under the 1992 headline A Terrorist Update, where he remarked that if you've ever been robbed by a black teenage male, you know how unbelievably fleet-footed they can be. He also referenced uncited surveys of blacks in a 1996 article, asserting that opinion polls show that only about 5% of blacks have sensible political opinions. He went on to remark in response to a report that 85% of all black men in Washington, D.C. are arrested at some point in their lives that, given the inefficiencies of the system, I think we can safely assume that 95% of the black males in that city are semi-criminal or entirely criminal. Furthermore, he wrote, it is hardly irrational to be afraid of black men. They commit murders, rapes, robberies, muggings, and burglaries, all out of proportion to their numbers. In that same newsletter, he endorsed lowering the age at which juvenile criminals can be prosecuted as adults, remarking, we don't think a child of 13 should be held as responsible as a man of 23. That's true for most people, but black males age 13 who have been raised on the streets and who have joined criminal gangs are as big, strong, tough, scary, and culpable as any adult and should be treated as such. This is the guy preaching small government and personal liberty. But there's a more troubling suggestion that Paul has an issue with blacks. In the summer of 1999 issue of the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, it was reported that Paul, alone among 86 senators and 424 congressmen, voted against awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to Rosa Parks, citing opposition to the cost of the medal, $30,000. The same article reported Paul's characterization of Congresswoman Barbara Jordan as a fraud and a half-educated victimologist whose race and sex protect her from criticism. In yet another article, Paul wrote that, quoting the journal article, blacks were more inclined to crime than any other profession and intellectually incapable of grasping important social and political issues. Further, the following unattributed statement appeared in his newsletters. Boy, it sure burns me to have a national holiday for Martin Luther King. I voted against this outrage time and time again as a congressman, which he misspelled in the plural. What an infamy that Ronald Reagan approved it. We could thank him for our annual Hate Whitey Day. But it's not just blacks. Paul, or he now claims his ghostwriters, seem to have a problem with homosexuals, too. Homosexuals, he wrote, allegedly, not to speak of the rest of society, were far better off when social pressure forced them to hide their activities. Now, Paul apologists will quickly jump in and say, oh, well, he didn't actually write that newsletter. It was done by ghostwriters and just had his name as the newsletter title for much of the time. So if I have David Duke post an article to lowgenius.net about how evil black people are without using a byline, that means I'm not responsible for the racist content of the message? What a pile of chicken lips. Paul won re-election as representative of his rural Texas congressional district in 1996 and has remained in Washington since. So we have a man who campaigns against government spending and has spent 27 years of his life collecting a paycheck from the government. A man who claims to stand for individual freedom but wants to imprison 13-year-olds as long as they're black. A man who's been trying to impose term limits on Congress since the 1970s and has himself served 12 full terms as a congressman plus a partial term. In March of 2001, he introduced a bill to repeal the 1973 War Powers Resolution, and later that year voted to authorize response to 9/11 via that same resolution. Months later, he turned around and made a principled stand against the Iraq War resolution, knowing full well that his vote would have no effect and serve only the interests of his continued political viability among the naive. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Paul has consistently promoted the abolishment of social welfare, citing the common fantasy that private charity will take care of it. He opposes universal health care, apparently assuming, rather illogically, that all physicians have multiple political positions and campaign funds to cover their living expenses while they work for free. In the Weiger interview, and consistently throughout his career, he's pushed the fantasy of job creation by lowering taxes on the wealthy and corporations, which is demonstrably proven in study after study after study to be completely fabricated. He claims to support taxation of corporations, but consistently votes against taxing them, as in the March oil subsidies vote. He claims to always give tax credits and always cut spending. These two things are diametrically opposed. Cutting tax income has zero functional difference from spending the money that those taxes would have brought in. Either way, the money isn't there anymore, and the government has to continue to provide everything it provides without that money. This is a vicious cycle perpetuated by right-wing fantasy economics. If we can just cripple the government enough so it cannot provide any services, then we will have great government. If our people die in the streets, that's just fine, so long as the government is involved. And if you think that's hyperbole, I got a nasty shock for you. Our people are dying in the streets right now. Paul's rhetoric and positions continue to thrive on the selfish, me-first attitude that has poisoned this country since Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. Taxes are stealing, but running a scam to collect money from stoned college kids, that's a legitimate business. He claims to oppose special interests and powerful corporations, and his opposition to those interests and corporations comes in the form of giving them free rein to poison the environment and exploit workers at will. He makes no distinction between payment of taxes to support services vital to a strong and evolved society like education and healthcare, and taking money out of poor people's pockets. And then he votes to give a $30 billion tax break to oil companies, leaving the middle class to make up the difference and the poor to bear the cost of misdirected middle class resentment over taxation in the form of opposition to healthcare and to education. He approves of credit transactions, but opposes the regulation of interest rates to keep people from being raped in credit transactions. He said in the Wire interview, and I quote, "Education is not a right. Medical care is not a right. These are things you have to earn." That's a direct quote. He cites increased tuition costs, but fails to recognize that much of that cost has been introduced by decades of banks driving prices up so they could profit from interest rates on loans. He waxes nostalgic about the glory days of his youth, but fails to recognize that in those days blacks and women rarely attended college at all, and the entire country was run by white males. He characterizes collective bargaining by labor unions as artificial power, and claims not to want to give corporations artificial power either, but then turns around and gives corporations precisely that power by voting for tax breaks and against common sense regulation of industry. He claims to support individual liberty, but strongly supports state laws prohibiting abortion. So apparently, he's only interested in individual liberty for white men. I could go on like this for days, and this article has already involved several hours of research on my part, referencing several weeks' work by those I've cited and many others. For those of you who are only watching the video, the site links are available on my website on the page for this article. The point is, Ron Paul's politics make no sense. He spouts things that sound good to pissed off white people and college kids who want to smoke pot without worrying about going to jail, but his actual policy positions, when examined closely, are substantively no different from those of the fringe right. All the power goes to those who have the money in their hands. They should be allowed to exploit those who don't to whatever extent humanly possible, and there should be no entity to stand in defense of the individual. That is Ron Paul's platform of liberty. He pushes the ridiculous fantasy that only government can be oppressive or act as a censor. He disguises his loathing for blacks, the poor, and gays as, quote, libertarianism, and in the process sucks money out of people's hands like a vacuum cleaner. Yes, he's done a few charitable things, and yes, his refusal to take Medicaid funds in his private medical practice or accept his congressional pension are consistent with his rhetoric. But that's about all the good you can say about him, and frankly the only reason he's able to even maintain that much integrity is that he can afford to. He does not live in a world of reality, and he is not interested in your freedom. He just wants you to be too stoned and stupid to notice that his entire philosophy is unsustainable in practice outside of the narrow parameters which define his own life. But my biggest objection to Paul isn't any of those things taken singly. My objection is this. His me-first attitude with no right to medical care and no right to education and taxes are stealing exemplifies what is destroying this country. He claims to pursue anarchy and meritocracy, but what he's really pushing is oligarchy and plutocracy. The maintenance and reinforcement of the same ridiculous status quo that has been pushing not only the spirit of this country, but the conscience of its people down a garbage disposal of Randite objectivism and laissez-faire capitalist greed at the expense of individual freedom and opportunity for the last 30 years. Ron Paul does not care about what's good for you or for this country. Ron Paul cares about what is good for Ron Paul. Don't be fooled by his snake oil salesman routine of legal pot and liberty. The only liberty he cares about is the liberty for the rich to get richer at your expense.